Snoop Dogg walked into the upscale jewelry store with his usual laid-back swagger, dressed in a casual tracksuit, signature shades perched on his nose. The store gleamed with glass cases full of diamonds and gold, but the real shine came from the confidence Snoop carried with him. He wasn't there to flex, he just wanted to pick out something special. But the moment he stepped through the door, the vibe shifted. The pristine, polished world of the high-end boutique froze, and all eyes turned his way. Behind the counter, a sharply dressed manager narrowed his eyes, his lips curling into a thin, dismissive smile. It wasn't just the tracksuit, it was the man wearing it. "Can I help you?" the manager asked, his tone dripping with fake politeness. But Snoop could hear what he really meant. It was clear, they didn't want him there. But Snoop wasn't about to let it slide. This wasn't just about jewelry. It was about respect. The high-end jewelry store on Rodeo Drive sparkled like a treasure chest under the bright lights, every surface polished to perfection, every glass case gleaming with diamonds, emeralds, and platinum. The kind of place where silence felt expensive and the scent of leather and luxury filled the air. Snoop Dogg stepped through the doors with his usual cool demeanor, dressed in a crisp blue tracksuit with white stripes running down the sleeves, and his signature shades reflecting the shine around him. His gold chain glinted under the soft lighting, but it wasn't loud, it was just him. He wasn't there to make a scene. He had a simple mission: pick out a gift, something special for a close friend. Maybe a custom chain or a pair of diamond earrings. But from the moment his sneakers hit the pristine marble floor, he could feel it, the vibe was off. The jewelry store was designed to make people feel small. From the moment Snoop Dogg stepped through the towering glass doors, the air itself seemed to change, cold, clinical, and heavy with quiet judgment. The faint scent of polished wood and expensive cologne mixed with the sterile sterility of wealth. The lighting, warm but purposeful, cast a glow on the endless rows of diamond-studded displays, each piece positioned like a trophy. But Snoop had been in rooms like this before. Spaces that weren't built for people like him. Spaces where the walls weren't just physical, they were unspoken barriers meant to keep certain people out. And the moment he walked in, he could feel it. From behind a long glass counter, the store manager glanced up, eyes flickering over Snoop Dogg with the precision of someone trained to evaluate customers at a single glance. His gaze lingered on the blue tracksuit, the laid-back posture, the confident stroll, taking it all in with the kind of expression that wasn't outright hostile, but carried something else. Doubt. The man didn't move at first, just stood there in his perfectly tailored navy suit, his hands resting on the glass case like he was bracing himself for something unpleasant. The creases in his forehead barely shifted, but the message was clear. "You don't belong here." Snoop saw it. He always saw it. The manager's lips curled into a tight, practiced smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Can I help you?" he asked. His voice had the same tone people used when they saw a stray dog near their yard. Snoop took his time before answering, adjusting his shades and letting the moment stretch. He wasn't one to let someone rush him. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice smooth, unbothered. "I'm looking for something special. Maybe you can show me what you got in here." The words weren't aggressive, but they weren't passive either. Just enough of an edge to let the manager know he wasn't someone to be brushed off. But the manager didn't move. Didn't even reach for a display key. Instead, he let out a slow exhale through his nose, the kind that wasn't loud but was still designed to be heard. A carefully controlled expression crossed his face, as if he were calculating his next move. Snoop could see the wheels turning. Could see the internal debate happening behind those cold blue eyes. The manager was running through a checklist. Was this man really a customer? Was he wasting their time? Was he even supposed to be in here? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the manager spoke. "I'm afraid we're by appointment only," he said, voice clipped and overly polite. Snoop raised an eyebrow behind his shades. "That right," he said, tilting his head slightly. "Didn't see no sign saying that outside." The manager gave a short, dry chuckle. "It's standard policy." His smile thinned even further. And, to be honest, sir, I don't think we have anything here that would suit your style. It wasn't what he said. It was how he said it. Snoop had been around enough to know what was happening. He wasn't being turned away because of the appointment policy, that was just the excuse. He was being turned away because this man had already decided he wasn't the right kind of customer. It wasn't about what he could afford. It was about who they wanted wearing their jewelry. A slow, quiet heat built in Snoop's chest, but he didn't let it show. He dealt with people like this his whole life. Some folks fought battles with their fists, but Snoop? He knew how to fight with presence alone. Snoop didn't move, didn't blink, didn't break eye contact. Instead, he leaned in just slightly, resting one hand on the glass case, his fingers tapping lightly against the pristine surface. The diamonds beneath his palm caught the light, refracting 1,000 tiny reflections against the polished floor. "You tellin' me," Snoop said, voice low and deliberate, "that out of all these diamonds, all this gold, you ain't got nothing that'd work for me?" The manager swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing slightly. He wasn't used to being questioned. He was used to control. And right now, he didn't have it. A shift happened, so subtle, most people wouldn't have caught it. The manager's grip on the counter tightened just a little. His smile, once effortless, now took work. His eyes darted toward the security guard standing near the entrance. A silent do-something glance. But the guard, a middle-aged man who had probably seen his fair share of bad calls, didn't move. Snoop caught it. "You nervous, dog?" Snoop asked, his voice almost amused. "Ain't even done nothing yet, and you already sweating me." The manager's jaw tightened. "I think it's best if you leave." And there it was. No pretense anymore. No politeness. Just straight up get out. Snoop could have left. Could have turned around, walked right back out those doors, and never thought about this place again. But that wasn't the point. He took his time straightening up, adjusting the collar of his tracksuit. Then, slowly, he pulled down his shades just enough for the manager to get the full weight of his gaze. "You know," he said, voice smooth but edged with something sharp, "I done spent my whole life walking into places where folks act like I don't belong." The manager stiffened. "But what's funny is," Snoop continued, his lips curling into the faintest smirk, "every single time, I end up proving them wrong." The manager opened his mouth, but no words came out. Snoop let the moment stretch, let the man feel it. Then, with a final nod, he slid his shades back on. "Aight," he said. "Your loss." And with that, he turned and walked away. As Snoop made his way toward the exit, the energy in the store had completely shifted. The other employees behind the counters had been watching, silent witnesses to a lesson they hadn't expected to learn today. The manager stood there, hands still clenched against the glass, watching Snoop leave, his own reflection staring back at him in the polished surface of the counter. He had won, hadn't he? He had gotten Snoop Dogg out of his store. But as Snoop stepped back onto the street, the sun hitting his chain just right, he knew something the manager didn't. This wasn't the end of the story. Because the real power move? It was the way people would be talking about this moment long after he was gone. The manager's words, "We're by appointment only," hung in the air like a bad note in an otherwise silent room. Snoop Dogg stood still, letting the words settle, not because he needed time to process them, but because he wanted the manager to sit with what he just said. The store was quiet enough that the soft hum of the air conditioning felt loud. The faint ticking of an ornate wall clock echoed in the background, marking each second of the awkward tension. Snoop's fingers drummed lightly against the glass case, the rhythm slow, steady, and unbothered. It wasn't the words that got to Snoop, it was the meaning behind them. The manager wasn't turning him away because of some policy. That was just a cover. The real reason was written all over his face, and the way his eyes scanned Snoop's tracksuit, the way his lips pressed into a thin, judgmental line. Snoop had been here before. Not this exact store, but this exact moment. The message was clear: you don't belong here. Snoop didn't flinch. didn't frown, didn't give the manager the satisfaction of seeing even a flicker of irritation cross his face. Instead, he slid his shades down just enough to lock eyes with the man. "Oh, it's like that?" Snoop said, his voice smooth, almost amused. "Didn't know y'all could judge folks before they even opened their mouth." His tone was calm, but there was a sharp edge beneath it. The kind of edge that made people uncomfortable because they knew they were being called out without a single curse word or raised voice. But the manager didn't back down. He straightened his tie, the fake smile vanishing entirely from his face. His voice dropped lower, his words clipped and cold. "I'm just saying," the manager muttered, "we don't have anything in here that would match your style." The pause before style was intentional. It wasn't about fashion. It was about who Snoop was, or at least who the manager thought he was. The disrespect wasn't loud, but it was there, buzzing beneath the surface like a mosquito you couldn't quite swat. The couple browsing engagement rings a few feet away froze, pretending to be interested in a diamond they'd already looked at 3 times. The tension in the room was palpable. Even the store clerk behind another counter shifted awkwardly, clearly sensing the situation but unsure whether to step in or stay silent. Snoop noticed it all. The way people reacted when things got uncomfortable. The way some folks looked away, hoping the moment would pass, while others watched, waiting to see what would happen next. Snoop leaned forward slightly, resting his elbow on the glass display. The diamonds inside sparkled under the lights, but his gaze never left the manager's face. "Let me tell you something, partner," Snoop began, his voice dropping to a near whisper, the kind that made people lean in even though they didn't want to. "Style ain't about what you wear. It's about how you carry yourself." The manager's jaw clenched, but Snoop wasn't finished. "And from where I'm standing," he continued, "looks like you the one who ain't got no style." The manager's composure cracked. His face flushed a deep red, and his voice wavered just enough to reveal his frustration. "I think it's best if you leave," he spat, the fake professionalism completely gone. "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone." The words weren't just policy now, they were personal. The manager had dropped the mask, revealing the disdain he'd been holding back since Snoop walked through the door. For a moment, the room held its breath. Snoop could have walked out right then. Could have shrugged it off like he'd done 100 times before. But this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who'd ever been told they didn't belong. So he stayed. Snoop stood up straight, pulling his shades off completely now, letting the manager see the full weight of his stare. "You ever stop to think," Snoop said quietly, "that maybe it ain't me who don't belong here?" The words hit harder than any shout could have. The couple by the rings exchanged glances, the tension in their faces easing into something closer to respect. Even the clerk behind the counter seemed to shift his posture, suddenly more aware of the dynamic at play. The manager, however, said nothing. His confidence had evaporated, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that he wasn't in control anymore. Snoop didn't need to say another word. The message was clear. He slid his shades back on, gave the manager one last look, a mix of amusement and quiet triumph, and turned toward the door. As he walked out, the sunlight hit his chain just right, sending a flash of gold across the marble floor. He didn't need their diamonds. He brought his own shine. And as the door closed behind him, Snoop knew one thing for sure. Respect wasn't something you bought in a jewelry store. It was something you carried with you. And Snoop Dogg? He'd been carrying it his whole life. The room felt like it had shrunk. The space between Snoop Dogg and the manager wasn't more than a few feet, but the tension stretched out like a taut rope about to snap. The polished glass counters, the sparkling diamonds, the sleek walls, they all faded into the background as the focus zeroed in on this quiet, simmering confrontation. Snoop didn't need to say much. His posture, relaxed but deliberate, spoke volumes. The manager's rigid stance was the opposite, tense, defensive, like he was clinging to the last shred of authority he thought he had. The other employees behind the counters exchanged subtle glances. The couple by the engagement rings had stopped pretending to browse, their attention now fully locked on the scene unfolding in front of them. The air itself seemed heavier, every breath a little harder to take. The manager tried to maintain his composure, but it was slipping fast. His perfectly pressed suit couldn't hide the nervous energy crackling beneath the surface. His hand, resting on the glass counter, twitched slightly, a subtle, involuntary movement that betrayed his frustration. He cleared his throat, trying to regain control, but his voice came out tighter than before. "I think it's best if you leave," he repeated, but this time there was no pretense of politeness. The words were sharp, clipped, and laced with an undercurrent of personal resentment. But Snoop didn't move. Instead of reacting, Snoop leaned in just a little closer, his gold chain catching the soft lighting of the store, reflecting tiny flashes of light onto the glass case below. His shades, now resting on his collar, revealed his eyes, sharp, clear, and unflinching. "You think just 'cause you wearing that suit, you got some kind of power over me?" Snoop asked, his voice low and steady. There was no anger, just a calm certainty that made his words feel heavier. The manager opened his mouth to respond, but stopped. The weight of Snoop's presence was suffocating, and for the first time, he realized he wasn't the one in control. The shift in power wasn't just between Snoop and the manager, it rippled through the entire room. The couple near the rings glanced at each other, their previous discomfort now mixed with curiosity and a growing sense of respect for Snoop's composure. Even the security guard near the entrance, who had been watching with mild disinterest, straightened his posture, sensing that this wasn't just an everyday confrontation. Snoop's calm wasn't just disarming, it was infectious. The store, which had been a fortress of quiet luxury moments ago, now felt like it belonged to him. The manager, realizing he was losing the room, tried to regain control. "Sir," he snapped, his voice louder now, "I've asked you to leave. This is a private establishment, and we reserve the right to refuse service to anyone." But the more he spoke, the more obvious his desperation became. His words were like glass, sharp but fragile, easy to see through and even easier to shatter. Snoop smiled slightly, not out of amusement but out of knowing. "You know what's funny?" Snoop said, his voice still calm, almost conversational. "You acting like you protecting something special in here. But all I see is a bunch of rocks behind glass. Ain't no soul in this place." The words hit harder than any insult. It wasn't about the jewelry, it was about the emptiness of the manager's authority, the hollowness of his control. Snoop leaned back, letting his words sink in, his presence filling the room more than any diamond ever could. The manager's face flushed with frustration, his carefully maintained facade cracking beyond repair. "I don't care who you are," he hissed, his voice dropping to a low, bitter tone. "You don't belong here." It was the slip Snoop had been waiting for. The mask was off. The polite pretense was gone. Now, it was just the raw, unfiltered truth. The manager didn't see Snoop as a customer. He saw him as an outsider. But Snoop had heard those words before. And he knew exactly how to respond. Snoop took a step forward, closing the distance until the manager had no choice but to meet his gaze. "You ever stop to think," Snoop said quietly, "that maybe it ain't me who don't belong here? Maybe it's you." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of every time someone had been judged by how they looked, how they dressed, where they came from. It wasn't just about this moment, it was about every moment like it. The manager didn't respond. He couldn't. His authority, his confidence, his entire sense of control had been stripped away, not by shouting, not by threats, but by the undeniable presence of someone who knew his worth. Snoop didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to make a scene. His calm, unshakable presence was enough to shift the entire dynamic of the room. Because real power doesn't come from what you own. It comes from who you are. With one final glance, Snoop slid his shades back on, his expression cool and collected. He didn't say another word. He didn't need to. The silence spoke louder than anything else could. As he walked toward the door, the couple by the rings nodded subtly in his direction, a quiet gesture of respect. The security guard gave him a knowing look, the kind that said, "I saw what you did, and I respect it." Snoop stepped out into the sunlight, the warm air of Rodeo Drive hitting his face as the door closed behind him. He didn't get what he came for, but he left with something more valuable, his dignity intact. Because sometimes, the strongest move you can make is standing your ground without ever raising your voice. And Snoop Dogg? He'd been standing his ground his whole life. The jewelry store, with its polished marble floors and gleaming glass cases filled with glittering diamonds and gold, stood frozen in a thick, suffocating silence as Snoop Dogg leaned casually against the display case, his calm demeanor belying the quiet storm that was brewing beneath the surface. The fluorescent lights above reflected off the pristine glass, casting fragmented prisms of light onto the perfectly polished floor, but none of that mattered now. The true focus of the room was the quiet, unspoken battle of wills between Snoop and the increasingly flustered manager standing across from him. The tension in the air was palpable, like static before a lightning strike, and everyone in the room could feel it, the couple pretending to browse engagement rings, the store clerks who had gone eerily still behind their counters, even the security guard by the door, who shifted his weight from one foot to the other, sensing that something significant was unfolding right before his eyes. The manager, his face a mask of forced professionalism barely hiding the frustration simmering beneath, straightened his tie and cleared his throat in an attempt to regain some semblance of control, but the effort was futile. His words, when they finally came, were laced with a thin veneer of civility that cracked with every syllable. "I think it's best if you leave," he repeated, his voice trembling ever so slightly, betraying the fact that he was no longer in control of the situation, despite his best efforts to maintain the upper hand. His eyes darted nervously around the room, seeking silent approval from the other employees, but finding none. Everyone was watching, waiting, and the power dynamic had already shifted irreversibly. Snoop didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't even shift his weight. Instead, he let the silence stretch out just a little longer, letting the manager stew in his own discomfort before finally responding with the same smooth, laid-back tone that had made him a legend. "You think just 'cause you wearing that suit and standing behind that counter, you got some kind of power over me?" he asked, his voice low and steady, each word landing with the weight of 1,000 unspoken confrontations from his past. His eyes, now visible beneath his lowered shades, were sharp and clear, cutting through the manager's fragile facade with surgical precision. The room seemed to contract around them, the air growing heavier with each passing second as everyone held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The couple near the engagement rings had stopped pretending to browse entirely, their eyes locked on the unfolding confrontation with a mix of curiosity and quiet admiration for Snoop's unwavering composure. Even the other employees, who had initially tried to keep their heads down and stay out of the conflict, were now fully engaged, their eyes flicking between Snoop and the manager, silently rooting for the man who had just turned their pristine, controlled world on its head. The manager's forced smile faltered, his carefully constructed mask of authority slipping with each passing second of Snoop's silent defiance. His jaw clenched, the veins in his neck standing out as he struggled to maintain his composure, but it was a losing battle. "I don't care who you are," he spat, his voice rising an octave as his frustration boiled over into outright hostility. "You don't belong here." The words echoed in the otherwise silent store, hanging in the air like a bad smell, impossible to ignore or take back. For a brief moment, the room was deathly silent, the weight of the manager's words pressing down on everyone like a heavy blanket. But Snoop didn't react with anger or indignation. Instead, he stood up straight, his full height towering over the manager, and spoke in a calm, measured voice that was somehow even more powerful than a shout. "You ever stop to think," he said quietly, his gaze never wavering, "that maybe it ain't me who don't belong here? Maybe it's you?" The simplicity of the statement, combined with the quiet confidence in Snoop's voice, hit harder than any insult or threat could have. The impact of Snoop's words rippled through the store like a shockwave, leaving everyone in stunned silence. The couple by the rings exchanged glances, their previous discomfort now replaced with quiet respect for the man who had just dismantled the manager's authority with nothing more than a few well-chosen words. Even the security guard, who had been hovering near the door, shifted his stance slightly, his rigid posture softening as he realized that this wasn't the kind of situation that called for intervention. The employees behind the counters, who had been holding their breath, now exhaled quietly, the tension in their shoulders easing as they watched the power dynamic in the room shift completely in Snoop's favor. The manager, realizing that he had lost control of the situation entirely, stood there in stunned silence, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water as he struggled to come up with a response. But there was nothing he could say. His authority had been stripped away, not with threats or violence, but with the quiet, unshakable presence of a man who knew exactly who he was and refused to be diminished by anyone's narrow-minded judgments. The manager's face, once flushed with righteous indignation, now paled with the realization that he had been thoroughly and completely defeated. Snoop didn't need to say another word. The silence spoke louder than any final remark could have. With a slow, deliberate motion, he slid his shades back onto his face, the reflective lenses catching the light and sending tiny flashes of brilliance across the room. He turned on his heel and walked toward the door, his steps slow and steady, each one a quiet testament to the power of dignity and self-respect. The room watched in silence, the sound of his footsteps the only thing breaking the heavy stillness. As Snoop stepped out into the bright California sunlight, the door closed softly behind him, but the impact of his presence lingered in the store long after he was gone. The couple near the rings exchanged one final glance before quietly leaving, their opinion of the store forever changed. The employees behind the counters resumed their tasks, but the lesson of what they had just witnessed would stick with them far longer than any transaction or sale. Because sometimes, the loudest statement you can make doesn't come from shouting or confrontation. It comes from standing your ground, knowing your worth, and refusing to let anyone diminish who you are. And Snoop Dogg? He'd been making statements like that his whole life. Just as the door was about to close behind Snoop, a new voice cut through the silence, a smooth, confident tone that made everyone in the store freeze once again. Snoop Dogg? Snoop paused mid-step, glancing back over his shoulder to see a sharply dressed man approaching from a back office. Unlike the manager, this man's face lit up with recognition and excitement. He wasn't just another employee, this was the owner. The manager's face drained of color as the owner crossed the room with an outstretched hand. "Man, I'm a huge fan," the owner said, shaking Snoop's hand with genuine enthusiasm. "If I'd known you were here, I would have come out sooner. What can we do for you today?" The room's energy flipped in an instant. The manager, now standing awkwardly by the counter, looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Snoop chuckled softly, his cool demeanor never slipping. "I was just looking for something special," he said, giving the manager one last knowing glance. "But I think I found what I needed already." As the owner enthusiastically offered to show Snoop the finest pieces in the store, Snoop politely declined, his point already made. The manager stood off to the side, his earlier arrogance now replaced by visible discomfort, unable to meet Snoop's eyes. Snoop didn't need to rub it in. The lesson was loud and clear, and it didn't need to be spoken. With a final nod to the owner, Snoop turned back toward the door. The security guard gave him a subtle nod of respect as he passed, and even some of the other employees offered small, appreciative smiles. The couple near the rings quietly followed Snoop out, their admiration for his quiet strength lingering in their expressions. As Snoop stepped back onto the bustling streets of Rodeo Drive, the sunlight bouncing off the luxury cars and boutique windows, he felt the cool breeze brush against his face. He didn't leave with a diamond, but he left with something far more valuable, his dignity, intact and untouchable. Because sometimes, it isn't about proving what you can afford or what you own. It's about